On the evening of the 20th of March 1974, a man named Ian Ball used his own Ford to ram a royal limousine to a halt on the Mall, the long ceremonial road that runs straight up to Buckingham Palace. He was armed with 2 pistols and a set of handcuffs, and he carried a typed note demanding a ransom of several million pounds. In the back of the car sat Princess Anne, 23 years old, beside her new husband, Captain Mark Phillips. Ball climbed out and started firing. His first bullet hit Anne's personal bodyguard. A journalist who stopped his taxi to help was shot next, then a constable who ran toward the gunfire, then the princess's chauffeur. 4 men wounded inside about a minute, and the gunman was now standing at the open rear door, with a pistol pointed at the future king's only sister. He told her to get out and come with him. The reply she is supposed to have given has trailed after her for 50 years. Not bloody likely. She stayed put. She argued with the man holding the gun, reportedly complained that the whole business was going to make her late, and seemed angrier about her torn dress than about the loaded weapon a few inches from her ribs. Hold that picture for a moment, because it explains Princess Anne about as well as anything could. And it tells you something uncomfortable about her older brother. Anne was the second child of Queen Elizabeth II, born 21 months after Charles. She was tougher than he was, blunter, harder to rattle, steadier in a crisis, and almost everyone who watched the family up close understood it. For most of their public lives, the people who ran the monarchy looked at the anxious, sensitive heir, then looked at his younger sister, and kept circling the same uneasy thought. The stronger of the two had been born second, and the old succession rules had then shoved her down the line behind both of the baby brothers who arrived after her for no reason beyond the accident of her being a girl. Charles spent decades being measured against Anne. For a long stretch of it, he kept losing. Hi, today I want to cover a request that has been sitting in my pile for the better part of a year. Princess Anne, the royal everybody calls hard-working and nobody quite knows what to do with, the sister the press treated as a punchline in the 1970s, and a national treasure by the 2010s, and the one person inside that family who seems to have come through the whole machine more or less intact. The version of her you probably carry around is the grumpy, horse-mad workhorse who turns up to 400 engagements a year and glares at photographers. That version is true enough. It is also about a third of the story. What interests me sits underneath it. In the long shadow, the comparison with Charles threw over both of their childhoods, because if you only know the modern image of the no-nonsense Princess Royal, you have missed the much stranger fact at the center of her life. She was, by a lot of contemporary accounts, the more capable of the 2 senior children. And the system was built so that capability counted for nothing. So get ready. Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise was born at Clarence House in London on the 15th of August 1950. Her brother Charles Philip Arthur George had arrived 21 months earlier, in November 1948. At the time of Anne's birth, their mother was still Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne, but not yet on it, and their father was Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a serving naval officer who, by every account of those early years, would much rather have been at sea than standing around a nursery. The young family had a brief window of something close to ordinary life. Philip was posted to Malta with the Mediterranean fleet. Elizabeth flew out to join him, and for a couple of years, the future queen got to be a fairly normal Navy wife at a villa called the Villa Gardamangia, throwing dinner parties and driving herself around the island. The children stayed behind in England a good deal of the time, looked after by nannies, which tells you something about the priorities at work before any crown had even landed on anybody's head. Then King George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham in February 1952, and the window slammed shut. Elizabeth became queen overnight. Charles was 3. Anne was 17 months old. The coronation followed in June 1953, and after that came the long Commonwealth tour, 6 months of it, from late 1953 into the spring of 1954, during which the new queen and her husband sailed and flew around half the planet shaking hands while their 2 small children remained in Britain. When mother and children were reunited at the end of it, the meeting was famously stiff. Elizabeth reportedly greeted Charles with a handshake rather than a hug, because that was the form, and because nobody in that family had ever been taught that a parent returning after half a year away might do anything warmer. This is the soil both children grew up in. Affection delivered through staff. Parents who loved them in the buttoned, distant, duty-first manner that the institution manufactured in every generation. Two nannies, Helen Lightbody and later Mabel Anderson, did most of the actual raising. The difference, and it showed up almost immediately, was in how the two children responded to all of it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching. From today, Charles was a sensitive, shy, easily wounded little boy. He cried easily, took correction hard, hated loud confrontation, and reached for the company of gentle adults. Above all, his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, who adored him and indulged him, and seems to have been the one person in his childhood who simply let him be soft. Anne was the opposite kind of small person, loud, fearless, physically bold, quick-tempered, and entirely unbothered by being told off. Where Charles flinched, Anne pushed back. Where Charles wanted reassurance, Anne wanted a pony and somewhere to gallop it. The household staff noticed it. The wider family noticed it, and one member of the family in particular built a whole theory of his children around. Prince Philip is the hinge of this entire story, so we need to be straight about him. He was not a cruel father in the old George V mold. He did not scream his children into nervous wrecks, and the people closest to the family have generally rejected the cartoon of Philip as a monster. What he was, by a lot of accounts including the authorized biography of Charles by Jonathan Dimbleby, was a man with very fixed ideas about what made a person worth respecting, and very little patience for the kind of son he had actually got. Philip valued toughness, self-reliance, and the ability to take a knock and a joke and keep going. He had survived a chaotic, half-stateless childhood himself, bounced between relatives, mother institutionalized, father gone off to Monte Carlo, and he had come through it by being hard and adaptable. He looked at Charles, who wept when teased and went pale when shouted at, and he found the boy baffling. Dimbleby's biography describes a father who could be sharp and dismissive with his eldest son, who mocked him at the dinner table in a way Charles experienced as humiliation, and who spent years trying to toughen the boy up by methods that mostly just frightened him. Charles, for his part, drifted further toward his grandmother and away from his father, which only confirmed Philip's suspicion that the heir was being coddled into. Weakness now put Anne into that same dining room. She gave as good as she got. She matched Philip's bluntness with bluntness of her own, traded the teasing straight back, and never seems to have crumpled under his particular brand of hard family banter. The result was that Philip and Anne understood each other. He could be sharp with her, and she would simply be sharp back, and he respected that. People who watched the family in the 1950s and 60s came away with the clear sense that Philip found his daughter easier to like than his elder son, not because he loved her more in any way you could measure, but because she spoke his language and Charles did not. So before either child was even 10 years old, the comparison was already running quietly inside their own home. One child the father wished was more like the other, and unfortunately for Charles, the other one was right there at the table every night, being exactly the kind of fearless that he was not. The schooling drove the wedge in deeper, and Charles got the worst of it by a wide margin, so it is worth slowing down here. Philip had a particular faith in the value of a hard, cold character-building education, and he had a specific institution in mind. Gordonstoun on the northern coast of Scotland, his own old school, founded by a German educator named Kurt Hahn who had fled Nazi Germany and built his entire philosophy around the idea that boys were improved by physical hardship, early starts, cold showers, long runs, and community service. Hahn's motto was that there is more in you than you think, and the school existed to drag that more out of you, whether you wanted it dragged or not. Charles had already done time at Hill House, a day school in London, and then at Cheam, a prep boarding school where he had been homesick and unhappy. In 1962, at 13, he was sent north to Gordonstoun, and he was miserable from almost the first night. He was a shy, unathletic, conspicuously royal boy dropped into a barracks culture that prized exactly the things he lacked, and the other boys made his life a sustained ordeal. Some of it was ordinary cruelty. Some of it had a particular logic because any boy seen being friendly to the heir to the throne was accused of sucking up, so the safest thing was to keep your distance or be openly unkind, which left Charles isolated in a way that was almost structural. He was, by his own later accounts, and those of his biographers, beaten about a bit in the dormitories, mocked for his ears and his accent and his softness, and left without the easy friendships that get most boys through that kind of school. The whole point of Gordonstoun was that suffering built character, so there was no shelter on offer. You were meant to endure, and Charles endured, but he hated it, and he came to associate the place with his father, because his father had chosen it for him precisely to make him into someone he was not. The single best surviving snapshot of how badly it went is the cherry brandy affair. In 1963, the 14-year-old Charles was on a school sailing expedition that put in at Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis. He went into a hotel bar to escape a crowd of people staring at him through the windows, felt cornered and self-conscious, and, casting around for something to order so as not to look like a child loitering in a pub, asked for the first drink that came into his head, a cherry brandy. A journalist happened to be watching. The story ran everywhere. A future king, underage, drinking spirits in a public bar, and the press treated it as a scandal of state. The fallout landed not on Charles but on the protection officer who had been with him, a detective named Donald Green, who was quietly relieved of his royal duties over the business. So the lesson the boy took from the episode was that he could not even order a drink without ruining a man's career, and seeing his own private embarrassment splashed across every front page in the country. That is a lot to absorb at 14, and it goes some way to explaining the wary, slightly haunted quality Charles carried into adulthood. The one bright patch in his schooling came when they sent him abroad. In 1966, Charles spent 2 terms at Timbertop, the rural outback campus of Geelong Grammar in Australia, and he genuinely loved it. Away from the British class system, away from the snobbery and the staring and the weight of being the heir on home soil, he found Australians who treated him more or less normally, and a landscape that asked nothing of him, except that he get on with the chores and the long bushwalks. He later said it was the making of him, and easily the happiest part of his education, which tells you that the problem was never simply that Charles could not cope with hardship. He could. The problem was Gordonstoun specifically, and the father standing behind it. Anne, meanwhile, was sent to Benenden, a girls' boarding school in Kent, in 1963. She did not love being away from home either, but she handled it the way she handled most things, by getting on with it, making herself useful, and refusing to be pitied. She was not a brilliant scholar, and she would be the first to say so, but she was capable, popular enough, sporty, and entirely functional inside an institution. The contrast practically wrote itself. The heir to the throne had to be all but rescued, year after year, from a school experience that left lasting scars and a public humiliation over a glass of cherry brandy. His younger sister was packed off to her own boarding school and simply coped. To any outside observer, and certainly to a father keeping a private scoreboard, it looked like one more entry on the same ledger. And then Anne went and did something that none of the rest of them could match. Something that took her from being the merely hardy sibling to being, for a while, the most genuinely impressive person in the entire royal family. She became a serious competitive athlete, not a royal patron of sport, not a smiling figure handing out rosettes, an actual athlete who qualified for things on merit and beat people who were trying their hardest to beat her. Horses were the thing she had always loved, and the discipline she chose, 3-day eventing, is a brutal test of nerve and skill that does not care who your mother is. Eventing combines dressage, cross-country, and show jumping, and the cross-country phase in particular involves galloping a half-ton animal flat out at fixed solid obstacles that do not move when you hit them. People are badly hurt doing it. People die doing it. Anne was very good at it. In 1971, riding a horse called Doublet that her mother had bred, Anne won the individual title at the European Eventing Championships at Burghley. She was 21. It was a real competitive victory at the continental level, judged on performance and nothing else. That same year, the British public, who can recognize a genuine sporting achievement when they see one, voted her BBC Sports Personality of the Year, an award given to the country's outstanding sportsperson and almost never to anyone with a royal title attached. For one strange stretch in the early 1970s, the most admired athlete in Britain and a member of the royal family were the same young woman. Then, in 1976, she went all the way. Anne was selected for the British equestrian team at the Montreal Olympic Games, competing in the 3-day event. She rode for her country at the Olympics. During the cross-country phase, she took a heavy fall, suffered concussion, was, by her own later account, unable to remember much of the rest of the round, and got back on and finished anyway because that was simply what you did. She did not win a medal. It did not matter. She remains the only British royal of her generation to have competed at the Olympic Games, and the only one whose place on a national team owed nothing whatever to her birth. Set that beside Charles. The heir played polo, enthusiastically and for many years, and he was a perfectly decent amateur. But he never came close to representing his country at anything. Never won a European title, never made an Olympic team, never had the nation vote him its Sportsman of the Year. This is not really a knock on Charles, because almost nobody achieves what Anne achieved at Montreal. But it sharpened the comparison to a fine point. The sister had walked onto the biggest sporting stage on earth and held her own among the best in the world. The brother had not, and the public could see the difference as clearly as the family could. By her mid-20s, Anne had built something Charles did not have and could not manufacture, a reputation for personal courage that she had earned in plain view, on her own the hard way. Which brings us to the part of this story that should make anyone with a basic sense of fairness wince. For all of that, Anne was sliding steadily down the line of succession, and she was sliding down it for one reason only. She was female. The rule that governed the British throne for almost the entire span of Anne's life was male preference primogeniture, and it worked exactly as ugly as it sounds. Sons came before daughters, always, regardless of who was born first. When Anne was born in 1950, she was second in line to the throne, behind only Charles. As a small girl, she stood directly behind her brother. Then in 1960, her younger brother Andrew was born, and because he was a boy, he's placed ahead of her in the line of succession the moment he drew breath. A baby, 10 years her junior, leapfrogged the future European eventing champion to stand who knows what years before her on the strength of his sex alone. Then in 1964, the youngest brother Edward arrived, and the same thing happened again. He too went ahead of her. By the mid-1960s, Anne had gone from second in line to behind both of her little brothers, and she had done absolutely nothing to deserve the demotion except fail to be male. People sometimes assume this was fixed. It was not, or at least not in any way that ever helped her. In 2013, Parliament passed the Succession to the Crown Act, which finally abolished male preference primogeniture and put sons and daughters on an equal footing. A real reform, long overdue. But it applied only to people born after the 28th of October 2011, and it was not made retroactive. It did not reach back and restore Anne to the place she would have held under fair rules. Her younger brothers stayed ahead of her. The law changed the future and left her exactly where the old prejudice had put her. Today, the Princess Royal sits somewhere down around 17th in line, well behind not just Andrew and Edward but their children, and behind a steadily growing crowd of nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. An Olympian and a 400 engagements a year worker parked in the queue behind toddlers because of a rule that everyone now agrees was wrong and that nobody got around to fixing in time to do her the slightest good. She has never, to her enormous credit, been heard to complain about it in public. That silence is itself a kind of statement. Now back to the mall, because the kidnapping deserves a fuller telling than the one-liner it usually gets reduced to. On the night of the 20th of March, 1974, Anne and Mark Phillips were being driven back to Buckingham Palace after a charity film event when a white Ford Escort swerved in front of their official car and forced it to stop on the broad, open ceremonial avenue, a few hundred yards short of the palace gates. The driver was Ian Ball, a man with a history of mental illness who had spent months planning to seize the princess and ransom her back to the Queen for a sum reported at around £3 million, with a half-formed scheme to use the money in some confused way connected to mental health care. He got out of his car holding 2 handguns. Anne's personal protection officer, Inspector James Beaton, got out to confront him and was shot almost at once, hit several times as he tried to shield the princess, his own pistol jamming after a single round. The chauffeur, Alexander Calendar, was shot when he tried to intervene. A passing journalist named Brian McConnell, who had stopped to help and walked toward the gunman with his hands raised, was shot in the chest. A constable, Michael Hills, who ran to the scene after hearing the commotion, was shot in the stomach but managed to radio for backup before he went down. 4 men, all of them shot trying to protect her, and remarkably, all of them survived. Through all of this, Anne was in the back of the car with a man pointing a gun at her and ordering her to come with him. She refused. By the accounts that emerged afterward, including those of the men who were there, she kept her head completely, told Ball flatly that she would not get out, and engaged him in a back and forth that bought precious time. The famous reply, the one history has handed down, came when he reportedly grabbed her arm and told her she had to come with him, and she answered with some version of "not bloody likely." I want to flag, in the spirit of being honest about these things, that the exact wording has been told and retold for half a century and was very likely tidied up somewhere along the way. The way famous lines always are. What is not in dispute is the substance. She did not panic, she did not comply, and she argued with an armed kidnapper as though he were an inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. The standoff ended when more police arrived, along with a passing former boxer named Ronald Russell, who walked up and punched Ball in the head, and the gunman was finally tackled and arrested. Anne, by every report, was furious about the damage to her dress and worried about being late, and she made a point of going to thank the wounded men afterward. The whole country read the story the next morning and understood something about the princess that no amount of official biography could have conveyed. The young woman the tabloids had been calling spoiled and snappish had stared down a loaded pistol and refused to flinch. The hard edge that did not always charm the press turned out to be made of something genuinely solid. The bravery did not go unmarked, and the honors handed out afterward tell you how seriously the country took what those men had done. Inspector Beaton, who had stepped between the princess and the gun and kept going after he was shot, was awarded the George Cross, the highest award for gallantry a civilian can receive, the peacetime equal of the Victoria Cross. Constable Hills and Ronald Russell, the boxer who had walked up and floored the gunman with his bare fists, were given the George Medal. Brian McConnell, the journalist, and Alexander Calendar, the chauffeur, received the Queen's Gallantry Medal. 5 men, none of them carrying anything more than nerve, had put themselves between a loaded pistol and Anne, and every one of them had held his ground. Ian Ball, found to be seriously mentally ill, was detained under the Mental Health Act and has remained in secure psychiatric care ever since. Anne, true to form, said far less about her own ordeal than about the men who had been hurt protecting her, and went to see them in hospital. That solidity became the organizing principle of the rest of her life, and it took the form of work. But before we get to the decades of dependable service, it is worth remembering just how badly the press treated her in the early years, because the gap between then and now is part of what makes her story strange. In the 1970s, Fleet Street wanted a fairy tale princess, decorative and demure and grateful for the attention. Anne flatly refused to be one. She found the constant photographing intrusive and said so. She was short with reporters who asked stupid questions. She declined to perform delight on cue, and the press denied the simpering princess they had ordered, retaliated by painting her as rude, sulky, spoiled, and bad-tempered, which became the settled tabloid line on her for the best part of a decade. The most quoted moment of this whole feud came at the Badminton horse trials in 1982, when she came off her horse and a scrum of photographers crowded in. and she is widely reported to have told them all to naff off, that famously almost polite British dismissal. The line delighted the public even as the papers tutted, because a great many ordinary people privately agreed that the photographers should indeed naff off. And here was a princess saying it out loud. I should note, again in fairness, that the exact words have hardened into legend and may have been buffed in the retelling, but the spirit of the thing was entirely real and entirely her. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What slowly turned that reputation around was not a charm offensive. It was the work, and above all one charity. In 1970, at just 20, Anne became president of the Save the Children Fund, and she took it on as a real job rather than a decorative patronage. She traveled, repeatedly and without much fanfare, to some of the poorest and most difficult places on earth on the organization's behalf, sitting in clinics and feeding stations and refugee camps, learning the operational detail of how aid actually works rather than just turning up for a photograph and leaving. She kept it up for decades. The same bluntness that read as rudeness at a horse trial read as seriousness in a famine zone, where what people needed was somebody who would ask hard questions and follow through, rather than somebody who would weep prettily for the cameras and forget the whole thing by lunchtime. Year after year, the woman the press had written off as a spoiled brat kept showing up in places no fairy tale princess would go and doing the unglamorous part of the job, and eventually even Fleet Street ran out of room to keep calling her useless. Because here is what she became, and has remained for decades, the hardest working member of the entire royal family by the plain measure of how many official engagements she carries out. In a typical year, she logs more public duties than almost anyone else in the family, often well over 500, opening hospitals and inspecting regiments and visiting charities at a pace that exhausts people half her age. She does not perform warmth. She does not gush. She has been known to tell photographers and officials exactly what she thinks of them in language that would never survive a palace press briefing, and the public, who can smell a fake a mile off, came to trust her precisely because she so obviously was not one. The most telling decision she ever made about the kind of royal she wanted to be concerned her own children, and it ties straight back to everything that had been done to her and her brother. We will come to it properly in a moment, but first, the marriages, because this is where the comparison with Charles gets genuinely instructive. Both siblings married badly, both got divorced. They handled the wreckage in completely different ways, and the difference tells you who they each were. Anne married Captain Mark Phillips on the 14th of November 1973, in a televised ceremony at Westminster Abbey watched by a vast audience. The date, by a small irony that nobody seems to have planned, was Charles's 25th birthday, so the heir spent the day of his sister's enormous public wedding, marking another year of being the unmarried Prince everyone was already nagging to settle down. Mark Phillips was a commoner and an army officer, and crucially, he was a serious horseman in his own right, an Olympic eventer who had won a team gold medal for Britain at the Munich Games in 1972. The two had met through the equestrian world, and at first the match made perfect sense since two driven riders who spoke the same horsey language. When they married, Phillips was reportedly offered an earldom and turned it down, choosing to stay plain Mark Phillips, which is part of the reason their children would carry no title. The marriage produced 2 children and a great deal of shared horse-related activity, and then it quietly stopped working. By the late 1980s, the two had drifted into living largely separate lives, joined by little beyond the stables. The cracks went public in stages, and not on terms Anne would have chosen. In April 1989, the Sun got hold of a set of private letters and revealed that they had been written to Princess Anne by a Royal Navy officer named Commander Timothy Lawrence, who had served as an equerry to the Queen and had got to know Anne in that role. The letters had been stolen. The palace confirmed as much, and their publication made it plain to the whole country that the princess had formed a close attachment outside her marriage. A few months later, in August 1989, Anne and Mark Phillips formally announced their separation. The picture got messier still in 1991, when it emerged through a New Zealand maintenance case that Phillips had fathered a daughter with a New Zealand riding instructor named Heather Tonkin during the marriage, a paternity later confirmed by testing. By the time the divorce came through in April 1992, there was nothing left to save and not much appetite to pretend otherwise. Then, in December of that same year, Anne married Timothy Lawrence in a small private ceremony at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral in Scotland, because the Church of England at the time would not remarry divorced people in church, and the Church of Scotland would, so she simply went north and got on with it without spectacle. That second marriage has lasted, and by every account it has made her happy, and she has never said a public word about it beyond the bare facts, which is exactly how she handles everything. Now compare that to what was happening to her brother in precisely the same window. Charles had married Lady Diana Spencer in 1981 in a wedding watched by an estimated 750 million people around the world, a fairy tale sold to the entire planet. By 1992, the same year Anne quietly divorced one man and quietly married another, the Charles and Diana marriage was disintegrating in the most public and damaging fashion imaginable. That was the year of Andrew Morton's book, written with Diana's secret cooperation, which laid out her unhappiness and Charles's affair in detail. It was the year of leaked, intimate, excruciating telephone recordings of both of them. It was, as the Queen herself called it in a speech that December, an annus horribilis, a horrible year, and a great deal of the horror was Charles's marriage coming apart in front of the cameras. Charles and Diana formally separated in December 1992 and divorced in 1996, and the whole catastrophe played out as a global soap opera that did lasting harm to the monarchy and to Charles's reputation in particular. Anne's marriage had failed too, but Anne's failure was managed like a private matter handled by an adult, while Charles's failure became one of the defining media disasters of the late 20th century. Once again, the comparison did not flatter the heir. The sister had ended a bad marriage and started a better one with the minimum of public bloodshed. The brother had turned the most famous marriage on earth into a slow-motion train wreck broadcast to billions. The Queen, who watched all of her children's marriages collapse in that period, with Charles and Andrew and Anne all coming apart within a few years of each. Other seems to have drawn her own conclusions about which of them she could rely on. In 1987, she had already given Anne the title of Princess Royal, the highest honor a sovereign can bestow on a daughter, a title held by only a handful of women across the whole sweep of British history and given entirely at the monarch's discretion. It was, among other things, a mother's vote of confidence, a public signal that of all her children, this was the one whose conduct she most trusted. Anne earned that trust the way she earned everything, by being dependable when others were not, by causing no scandal of her own making in the years when scandal had become practically the family business, and by doing the job without ever seeming to want anything for herself. Which finally brings us to the children, and to that decision I mentioned, because it is the clearest window into what Anne actually learned from the way she and Charles were raised. When her son Peter was born in 1977, the Queen's first grandchild, and her daughter Zara followed in 1981, Anne and Mark Phillips chose not to give them royal titles. As the children of a princess, they could have been styled with the full trappings of royalty. Anne declined them. She wanted Peter and Zara to grow up as ordinary, untitled people who could go to normal schools, take normal jobs, marry whom they liked, and live lives that were not defined from birth by a rank they had not chosen. It is one of the quietest and most quietly radical things any senior royal of her generation did. A parent deliberately handing her children less status than they were entitled to because she had watched, up close, what too much of it could do to a person. She had seen her brother bent half out of shape by the weight of his role and the school it sent him to. She had felt the absurdity of her own position in the line of succession. She had spent her whole life inside a machine that prized the institution over the human being every single time, and when it came to her own children, she stepped them out of the worst of it. The choice has aged extraordinarily well. Peter went into business and sports management and lived a life recognizably closer to that of an ordinary well-connected Englishman than to that of a prince, with the freedom to make his own way and his own mistakes out of the worst of the glare. And Zara, untitled and free to compete as a private individual, did something that closes this whole story in a neat and rather moving circle. She became an event writer, like her mother, and a far more decorated one. In 2006, she became eventing world champion, and that same year the British public voted her BBC Sports Personality of the Year, the very award her mother had won 35 years earlier in 1971, the two of them now the only mother and daughter to have taken it. Then in 2012, at the London Olympics, Zara won a team silver medal in eventing, and the medal was hung around her neck by her own cousins at the medal ceremony, which is about as strange and lovely a sentence as this family produces. A princess who had been denied a fair place in the line of succession had raised a daughter with no title at all, who stood on an Olympic podium on pure merit in front of the whole country, with the family looking on. There is more dignity in that arrangement than in most of the gold-braided alternatives, and it is the kind of legacy you cannot inherit. You have to build it. Now I have to push back on my own story, because I have been doing to Charles more or less what the family did to him, holding him up against his sister and finding him wanting. And that is not the whole truth either. The lazy version of this tale turns Anne into a hero and Charles into a hopeless disappointment, and that version is unfair to the point of being false. Charles was not a weak man or a stupid one. He was a thoughtful, anxious, often lonely person who happened to be born into the single most scrutinized role in the country, with a temperament almost perfectly unsuited to surviving it in comfort, and who nonetheless built a record of real substance that the comparison with Anne tends to bury. In 1976, the same year Anne was at the Olympics, Charles founded the Prince's Trust, a charity to help disadvantaged young people get training, jobs, and a start in life. It has since helped hundreds of thousands of them, and it is, by any honest reckoning, one of the most effective things any modern royal has ever set up. He was decades ahead of nearly everyone on the environment, talking about pollution, sustainability, and organic farming back in the 1970s and 80s, when it got him written off as a crank who chatted to his houseplants. He turned his Highgrove estate over to organic methods long before that was respectable and launched the Duchy Originals food brand on the same principle, and the world has since come around to almost everything he was once laughed at for saying. His blunt attack in 1984 on a proposed modern extension to the National Gallery, which he called a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved friend, set off a genuine national argument about architecture, and whatever you make of his taste, he cared about the texture of ordinary places in a way most powerful people never bother to. And here is the harder thing to say. The two of them were not opposites at all. They were two children of the same cold house, shaped by the same absent parents and the same brutal logic of duty before warmth, and they had simply grown different armor. Anne's armor was hardness. She met an emotionally withholding world by becoming impervious to it, by refusing to need anything from anyone, by turning her own toughness into a fortress that nobody could get into and nobody could dent. That armor served her superbly in a kidnapping and across 50 years of public service, and it almost certainly cost her something in private that she will never discuss, because discussing it is exactly the sort of softness the fortress was built to keep out. Charles's response to the same childhood was the reverse. He stayed porous. He kept feeling things, kept being wounded, kept reaching for the warmth and the validation that had been rationed in the nursery, which made him an easier target and a messier adult, and arguably a more openly human one. Neither response is the right one. They are two different injuries from the same source. The family and the public simply found Anne's injury more convenient because a daughter who never complains and never cracks is a great deal less trouble than a son who aches in public and marries the wrong woman in front of the entire world. So why was Anne, the child Charles was always compared to? Partly because she was, by several real measures, the more impressive of the two, the better athlete, the steadier nerve, the harder worker, the one who handled disaster with less drama, partly because their father had decided, before either of them could read, that toughness was the only virtue that counted, and toughness was the one quality the daughter had in abundance and the son seemed to lack, and partly because the comparison was always rigged in a way that did neither of them any favors. It measured both children against a single narrow idea of unshakable hardness, declared Anne the winner, and quietly punished Charles for being the kind of person who could be hurt. The cruelest part is that the contest never carried any stakes at all for the person who kept winning it. Anne could be as magnificent as she pleased, the European champion, the Olympian, the woman who stared down a gun, the worker who never stopped, and none of it could ever put a crown on her head, because the rule written long before she was born had displayed that her brother's sex outranked her entire character. She got the admiration. He got the throne. He was crowned King Charles III in 2023, at the age of 74, the longest-serving heir apparent in British history, and his sister stood in the abbey watching, the way she has stood and watched, and done her duty her whole life, 17th or so in a line she should have been near the top of. By the time it ended, the country had long since changed its mind about her. When the Queen died at Balmoral in September 2022, it was Anne who had been there in those last days, and Anne who then accompanied the coffin on its long journey south, standing vigil beside it in Edinburgh and again in London, the only daughter among the children keeping watch over her mother. She carried out the whole exhausting duty with the same straight-backed, unsentimental steadiness she had brought to everything else, and a public that had once dismissed her as the rude one watched her do it and understood at last and completely what it had in her. The reversal was total. The princess that Fleet Street had spent the ninth seats calling spoiled and sulky had become, by something close to national agreement, the most respected working royal in the country, the safe pair of hands, the one everybody trusts to turn up and get it right and never make it about herself. She got there by outlasting the caricature, by simply being dependable for so long that the caricature could no longer carry the weight of the evidence against it. There is a lesson in that about how reputations actually move, and it has nothing to do with charm. You can argue all day about which of them got the better deal. The brother, who finally took the prize after a lifetime of waiting and being found, wanting, or the sister who never had a shot at the prize but kept the one thing nobody could take from her, which was the country's respect. People who have spent careers studying this family disagree about all of it. What is harder to argue with is the shape of the thing when you lay it out end to end. Two children raised cold, sent away, measured against each other from the cradle. One of them turned out tougher, and the system rewarded her with everything except the throne. The other turned out softer, and the system handed him the throne, and a lifetime of being told he was not quite good enough for it. Whatever else you take from the story of Princess Anne, take this. The strongest child in that generation was born second, and being strong was never going to be enough. Anyway, thanks for sticking around for another one of these. If there is somebody from this peculiar parade of 20th century royals you want me to look at next, drop the name below. I read them all. I answer roughly none of them, but I do read them. See you next time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.